night, during my 3rd week of night float, Kevin paged me at 3 a.m. Elba Rodriguez's blood count just dropped 13 points, he said. Get over to 16 North and figure out where she's bleeding from. I raced down the stairs and ran into Kevin walking out of Mrs. Rodriguez's room. I just took her blood pressure and did a repeat blood count, he said. Go do a rectal exam and see if she's bleeding from her GI tract. My pocket was already stocked with gloves, petroleum jelly, and test cards to check for blood in the stool. I strode into the room, crack night float intern, ready for battle. Mrs. Rodriguez was a tiny, wrinkled Dominican woman with frizzy gray hair amassed on the pillow. She was wearing a worn floral housecoat and cardigan sweater over her hospital gown. Her daughter, grandson, and a few other relatives stood gathered around her bed. They all turned and looked at me with concern on their faces. I cleared my throat. Hi, I'm Dr. Ofri. I hope that sounded convincing. I'm one of the night float doctors taking care of Mrs. Rodriguez. I know the other doctor was already here to see her. I'm just here to do the rectal exam. Yep, Dr. Ofri, rectal specialist. The grandson stepped forward. He was slim and amber-skinned. A small mustache graced his upper lip. I understand what you have to do. I'm a nurse. If you don't mind, I'd like to stay here while you do it. My grip on the metal railing of the bed tightened. Stay while I do the rectal? Well, I stammered. Were family members allowed to be present for rectals? But he was a nurse. Well, if you want to. Where was Kevin? Why wasn't I home in bed like the rest of the civilized world? I gestured somewhat inanely in the air and shrugged my shoulders. Whatever you want, I guess. The rest of the family left the room. I pulled the curtain so that Mrs. Rodriguez, the grandson, and I were separated from the 3 other sleeping patients. The grandson stood to Mrs. Rodriguez's right, and I stood to her left. We rolled her toward the grandson, and I fumbled with her housecoat, cardigan sweater, and hospital gown to get down to her skin. I fished around in my pockets to unearth the necessary equipment and suddenly realized that I was missing the little bottle of developer fluid to do the test for blood in the stool. I looked over to the grandson, who was balancing his grandmother on her right side. Could you hold her there for just 1 minute? I need to get one more thing. I dashed out of the room, studiously avoiding eye contact with the family members waiting in the hall. I ran to the 16 North supply closet, but there wasn't any developer fluid on the shelf. I dug through the drawers and the storage bins, but I couldn't find any. All the other interns had probably pocketed them. I raced out of the supply closet, down the hall, around the corner to 16 West. I tore through the supplies in their closet, sweating under my polyester coat. No developer fluid. The cardiac care unit. They were always well stocked. I knew the nurses guarded their supplies like hawks, so I snuck into the CCU from the back door, where the bedpans and dirty laundry were kept. I tiptoed over to the supply shelf in the far corner. IVs, chest tubes, iodine swabs, glycerin swabs. Where was the damn developer fluid? Aha! Tucked behind the 5cc syringes was a single yellow bottle developer. I snatched it just as the nurse yelled, "Hey, those are CCU supplies!" I jammed the bottle in my pocket and dashed out of the CCU with my head down. From the back, all interns looked alike, I hoped. I was panting when I got back to Mrs. Rodriguez's room. Her grandson was still balancing her on her right side. His face was calm, and he didn't say a word. I gloved up and slathered my right index finger with petroleum jelly. Gingerly, I slid my finger into Mrs. Rodriguez's rectum. I bit my lower lip as I concentrated on my assigned task. I felt around, hunting for any abnormal masses. I wriggled my finger, attempting to snag a sample of stool to check for blood. Rectal tone, I reminded myself. Don't forget to assess for adequate rectal tone. Good job, I complimented myself as my fingertip hooked onto a suitably firm piece of stool. I'll just pull out this little tidbit, smear it on the card, plop some developer fluid on it, and maybe I'll be able to get some sleep before the nurses do their 6 a.m. vitals and start calling with the next round of fevers. I think Mommy is no longer with us, the grandson quietly announced. I froze in mid-rectal and looked up at the grandson. His calm expression hadn't changed. My heart began to pound inside my ears. No longer with us? What was he talking about? With his free hand, the grandson crossed himself thoughtfully and murmured something in Spanish. No longer with us? Mrs. Rodriguez was dead? The bit of stool was still hooked onto my fingertip. I could feel a hot stickiness tingling under my shirt. How could she be dead? The grandson let out a soft sigh. Mommy didn't want any extraordinary measures. We signed the DNR together. I'm so glad we didn't do any machines or tubes. It's the way she wanted, drifting off in peace. We just need you to pronounce her dead, doctor, then we can take her home. I stared at the grandson, blinking repetitively as my mind blanked out to nothingness. The window beyond him was pitch black. There was no moon. A few faint lights twinkled from across the East River. I couldn't remember where I was or who I was or what I was doing here. I could only hear my heart thud rhythmically. Dead, that's right, Mrs. Rodriguez is dead. My own breathing resumed and I realized that I should probably remove my index finger from Mrs. Rodriguez's rectum. I slid my hand out and stared at it blankly. Dead. Mrs. Rodriguez is dead. I tore the glove off. Suddenly my mind began to race. How do I declare a person dead? Pupillary reflexes, that's it. A dead person doesn't have pupillary reflexes. I pulled out my flashlight and shone it confidently in Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes. To my dismay, she had huge cataracts. She wouldn't have pupillary reflexes anyway. Respirations. A dead person won't breathe. I whipped out my stethoscope. By now, the whole family had come in from the hallway and gathered around the bedside. They followed my every move as I inserted the stethoscope in my ears and carefully planted the bell on Mrs. Rodriguez's chest. I listened carefully. Suddenly, a vibrating twitch ran through her body. I jumped back, and the family looked at me with worried eyes. Was this rigor mortis, or might she still be alive? It suddenly dawned on me that I'd never had a lecture in medical school on how to tell if someone is dead. I guess it was assumed to be pretty obvious. Dead is dead, and if you're not dead, then you're alive, right? I thought about paging Kevin, but the family was staring intently at me. How could I leave now? Pulse, that's it. Dead people for sure don't have a pulse. I ran my fingers along her left carotid and then along her right carotid. Of course, the only way you know you found the pulse is when you find the pulse. How do you know when you haven't found one? How do you document the absence of something when its presence is defined by hunting until you found it? Maybe I just wasn't feeling in the right place. I fumbled through the folds of skin and neck muscles. Maybe the pulse was hidden behind the sternocleidomastoid muscle. It wasn't there. Did that mean she was dead, or I just couldn't find it? Maybe it was a half inch to the right. Maybe it was deeper, or maybe I was pressing too hard. Was I supposed to cover every inch of her body to prove that I couldn't find a pulse? Another shiver ran through her body and then echoed through mine. The family looked at me, their eyes gathered in a single longing stare, waiting for an answer. How could I say anything? What if I got it wrong?